We know where his raw materials came from. So he is a metal worker, mostly making trinkets, candlesticks, and statues. And he uses bronze and lead for that. And in the shop, in the collapsed part of these cabinets, we found lead bars. And these lead bars are very interesting because they have 5 stamps on them. The first stamp is from the mine where the lead originates. Then you have a stamp with the customs official in the port of departure. Then you have a stamp for the wholesale merchant buying the whole thing up. Then you have the stamp from the customs official in the port of arrival. And then you have the stamp from the merchant buying up this stuff and retailing it to craftsmen like that in small quantities, right? So these anonymous networks of trade make high urban specialization like that possible. And what's really striking about cities like Pompeii, which after all is a small country town in Campania, right? It's not a big city, it's not a famous place, is that almost all streets are lined by shops, right? You can see all these tabernae, also in public buildings like Bath here, lining almost every street like Pompeii. And in Pompeii, 600 shops have been counted, which basically could have been rented out or owned by individual artisans. And if you compare that to 400 houses, right, you can get an idea of how commercially oriented the character of these places must have been. And that, of course, you know, and here I'm just showing you Ostia, the port of Rome, and you see all these gray areas, right? All these gray areas are shop areas, commercial areas, rentals, right? An enormous amount of urban space. But that, of course, leads to the question, how can so many artisans and shopkeepers function in a city that's relatively small, right? So if you have a city of only 10,000 people and you've got 600 businessmen, how are they going to sell their stuff, right? That's basically a question of demand. And that is again made possible through these networks of trade and exchange I was talking about. And let's just quickly look at how this looks in the northern provinces. So we've just looked at Italy. If you look at a new city in the northern provinces, you again see, right, all the streets in a city like Xanten, the Colonia Alpia Traiana, are lined by shops, right? These rectangular houses are so-called shop houses, right? So every Roman city in the imperial period is lined by shops, all the streets. And again, the question arises, how does that work? Whom are they actually selling their stuff to? And in the east, and we're going to talk about that in a moment, this takes the form of these wonderful colonnaded streets here in Aquileia in Syria. And behind most of those colonnades, you actually have shops too, right? So in a place like Aquileia, you would have had almost 2 miles of shops, right? Again, that raises the question, how do these people have enough customers? Why does the system work for such a long period of time? Now, unfortunately, Roman intellectual elites are totally uninterested in the life of shopkeepers, right? They couldn't care less about them. Just think about Cicero. He thinks what they are doing is sordid, right? Working in a workshop, that's the lowest of the lowest that you can actually do, and therefore they don't write about it. And unfortunately, the Romans wrote most of their stuff not on clay tablets like in the ancient Near East, they wrote it on papyrus. And papyrus, of course, easily disintegrates, and we only have a few fragments here and there from Egypt and Syria. But we are lucky when we're actually going to a place in Austria, in the mountains in the Alps, and what we are talking here about is a commercial settlement in a client kingdom of Rome, the settlement on the Magdalensberg in Carinthia, Austria. So what we see here again, you know, is a series of shops and shop houses with a colonnade in front of it. So very nicely done. But what all these buildings also had were cellars, storage cellars. And in these storage cellars, the artisans and business owning these shops were stretching hundreds of business notes into the beautiful wall painting. And these business notes usually tell us how much stuff they sold to which merchant and where he was from. And from the Magdalensberg in Carinthia, Austria, we learned that the owners of these 2 particular shops were blacksmiths. And when they sell something, they are not selling small item numbers. For instance, the guy to whom this shop belongs sells at one point 200 anvils, right, to one single merchant from Aquileia. And hundreds and thousands of hose, pitchers, steel rings, and so forth. So they are not trading in small quantities. They are trading in large quantities. and at least some people working in such a taberna economy in small shops are part of larger networks of exchange by not catering to individual merchants, but to wholesale traders. So the Magdalensberg is about here, where Virunum is. So they basically trade with Aquileia, a major seaport in the Adriatic Sea, the forerunner of Venice. But interestingly, the people mentioned in these graffiti come from as far apart as here, Volubilis, right, in contemporary Morocco. Interestingly, at the time that the settlement flourishes, Noricum is not even part of the Roman Empire, right? And also Mauritania isn't part of the Roman Empire, right? But Roman ways of doing business basically permeate even the periphery of the Mediterranean world. Now, what I would like to talk about now is, what does that mean culturally, right? What does it mean if we effectively have a lot of shopkeepers dominating the character of ancient cities? Now, the Platero of Ephesus, so this large colonnaded street that you see here in a photograph, basically cuts the city in two, right, from gate to gate. And it has a strong unifying aspect. You can basically traverse the city on this magnificent street without ever stopping at a forum, a temple, or another public building. And the public face of the city will then, in many ways, be the shopkeepers who are basically setting up shop behind this colonnades. So what does it mean that these people are now so visible? And interestingly, in the 2nd century CE, this seems to translate into some political and also civic influence. And here I'm just showing you a rather interesting fragment of a text that a famous Greek intellectual called Diochrysostom writes. Diochrysostom is a good friend of the emperor, right? He is a flashy intellectual. And what he wants to do, well, perhaps I should just go back here for 2 seconds, is to build a platea like that in his hometown. He feels that Prusa deserves such a colonnaded street, right? All the neighboring cities have such a beautiful colonnaded streets. Prusa should have one too. But in the process of constructing such a thing, a lot of previous buildings have to go. And because, of course, the streets of a Roman city are lined by shops, a lot of shops need to be demolished, right? Now, Dio isn't a very smart man, at least when it comes to local politics, because he doesn't rebuild the shops at the same spot, right, which is prime commercial real estate, but says, oh, we have a colonnade here, that's so beautiful, that's what we want. But as a result, the artisans and shopkeepers of Prusa rebel against him, right? They smear him in the public assembly, they threaten his friends in the city, and at the end of the day, the entire project probably needs to be scuttled. And Diochrysostom, a member of the imperial elite, is very upset about this, which shows you the difference in ideology and economic reality that I was talking about. So he says here in this very bitter speech, but there was a lot of talk, though not on the part of many persons, and very unpleasant talk too, to the effect that I'm dismantling the city, that I have laid it waste, virtually banishing the inhabitants, that everything has been destroyed, obliterated, nothing left. And there were some who were so violent in the lamentations over the smithy of so-and-so, he's not even honored with his name, feeling bitter that these memorials of the good old days were not preserved. One might have supposed that the Propylaea at Athens were being tampered with, or the Parthenon, or that we were wrecking the Heraium of the Samians, another famous temple, or the Didymaeum of the Milesians, or the temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the world, instead of ridiculous ruins. And yet there are some who were distressed to the signs of their former poverty and ill repute disappearing, who, far from being interested in the columns which were rising, or in the eaves of the roofs, or in the workshops under construction elsewhere, but you don't want shops elsewhere, right? You want shops at the main platea of the city, were interested only in preventing your ever feeling superior to that motley crew of blacksmiths. So from an elite perspective, colonnades are about making a city pretty, right? And shows a remarkable lack of understanding for the people actually doing business on these streets. But what's interesting is that if a personal friend of the emperor, a billionaire, comes along and says, I want to have my platea here, the blacksmiths can organize and cause him a lot of trouble. Another famous episode is, of course, in the Acts of the Apostles, the Ephesian silversmiths. I'm not sure whether you remember that story. So Paulus comes to Ephesus and preaches the new faith and the silversmiths at Ephesus who are making devotional shrines for Artemis feel that he is ruining their business, right? And they gather and basically drag Paulus or his representatives to the theater and accuse him, right? So again, these people can organize and basically form a new type of urban stratum. And despite the scorn, right, that people feel for artisans, craftsmen, and urban businessmen, these people seem to be very comfortable with who they are. And here I'm showing you a very famous monument. It's the tomb of a baker, right, in the city of Rome, of a guy called Eurysakes. So the tomb is rather big. I would probably only come up to here, so it's a very large monument. It stands at one of the entrances to the city. It stands at the bifurcation of two major Roman roads, so it's a very prominent monument. And it does not represent what Roman aristocrats would have found important. What it does on its frieze up here is glorifying the art of bread making. So you don't have Amazons, you don't have Greek myth, you have people baking bread, kneading dough, putting it on donkeys, carrying it to the market. And here you just see one of those fragments. And these large porthole-like openings, well, they are bread kneading machines, right? Basically the basis of bread kneading machines like that, where you would have inserted such a wooden contraption in here. And when it comes to how he commemorates himself, right, he basically refers to his tomb as his bread basket. He says, me and my wife, we are buried in this bread basket here, and my name is Marcus Vergilius Eurysakes. I'm a baker, obviously, right? So a strong self-confidence of these urban businessmen. And this is not an outlier. So what's interesting in a place like Ostia is that by the 2nd century CE, the city, at least on its large urban streets, is not dominated by shopkeepers through their shops. It's also being redone by their clubhouses. So basically, these businessmen organize themselves in voluntary associations, so-called collegia, and they start building clubhouses like that. That's the clubhouse of the contractors of Ostia, which stands right on the forum, so basically at the most prominent part of the colony. This large building here is the clubhouse of the Shippers Guild of Ostia, which actually used to belong to a Roman consul, right? And after he is assassinated and his property is auctioned off, voluntary associations of local businessmen think, yeah, consul's house, that's just good enough for us, right? And again, this self-confidence is reflected on monuments like this. So here's a sarcophagus of a guy called Junius Palaeohodus, who is the president of Ostia's Contractors Club, right? He can obviously afford a very nice marble sarcophagus. And the first thing he says in his funerary inscription is who he is. He is the Magister Quinquinalis of the Collegium Febrorum Tignariorum, right? That is his main identity, which is interesting if you think that people like Cicero 200 years earlier would have said, that's sordid, you don't talk about that, you know? If you have money, buy a piece of land and be quiet, right? Like, try to be a landed gentleman. These people obviously don't think about that in any terms. Or for instance, a Corinthiarius, a maker of very fine luxury vessels from the city of Rome, not only gives his job, right, in the second line of the inscription, he also says Teatro Balbi, which means that he gives the location of his shop, right? And this is a funerary altar that would have stood atop a brick mausoleum, so it would have been widely visible, right? So no shame in this. Yes, I'm a maker of bronze stuff, and I'm very proud of this. And in some communities, craftsmen even rise to the level of local government. So here we see a funerary relief from a tomb of a sculptor, it's just made a bust here, who is called Quintus Lollius Alcamenes. And he is he's a decurio, so he's a town councillor of his unnamed city. Unfortunately, we don't know which city. And he also is a duumvir, which means that he made it mayor at one point, right? So these successful urban businessmen, who are then, of course, ultimately not living above their own shop anymore, then also start taking over public space and being proud of this. Now, let me compare these monuments, these funerary monuments of very successful businessmen to the monument of an Anglo-Saxon king in Britain. And this is the tumulus, the barrow of Sutton Hoo, that we are going to have a look at in a moment, which is basically from the time that the system of Mediterranean interconnectivity, trade, and so forth has broken down, right? So he is buried barbarian fashion in his Viking longboat, right, under a barrow. And of course, most of you probably will have seen this, right, which is the beautiful jewelry coming from his tomb. And when you're looking at this belt buckle, you know, it's really a matter of taste whether you like that better or whether you like naturalistic classical art better. This is just as good as it gets in terms of jewelry making. But that's something that archaeologists find boring. Gold's always boring. We don't like gold. Gold doesn't tell us much. What tells us a lot is the type of imported ceramics that we find in this tomb. And this here, this badly made hand-shaped bottle, right, which is not even made on a potter's wheel, is an import from France, and it contains wine. And all the other ceramics in this tomb are brittle, badly handmade pottery. So what has happened, right? Britain was part of the Roman Empire, and when the imperial system collapses, when this highly specialized system of production and also exchange of cheap, high-quality, mass-produced wares collapses, people resort to a kind of simplicity, right, that was unprecedented even before the Romans came, right? So if you don't have large pottery kilns anymore that produce for entire regions because it's destroyed, right, because the system of imperial governments and law is destroyed, you have to make your own ceramics again with hands. You don't even know what a potter's wheel is anymore, right? At a time where every artisan can expect to have his garum, olive oil, and wine in the 2nd century CE, well, a king of the Anglo-Saxons has to do with a bottle like that, right? And that is then basically his Bordeaux or whatever that he imports. So the point that I'm just trying to make by looking at the end of antiquity and trying to figure out what has happened in between is to give you an idea what this system of Mediterranean interconnectivity of trade and urban specialization did, right? It basically raised standards of living to an incredibly high level, but also basically added some type of fragility to the economy. If you have a lot of specialized craftsmen who do not produce for local demand, but basically are part of a larger system of exchange, and you as a barbarian come along and destroy that all, even if you would like to keep it up, it completely collapses and leads to stuff like that. And that's perhaps a good point to stop and invite questions. Thank you very much for your attention. Yeah.
Is there any evidence of factory structures? Because you said there was large-scale trading in goods.
Yeah.
I can't see it coming out of little individual households or shops.
I mean, there are later factories in late antiquity, so-called fabricae, which are set up to produce army equipment. But what's really striking about these small workshops is, for instance, on the Magdalensberg that I showed you, is that obviously in this workshop, because we also have the smithy in there, right, a lot of stuff was produced in this in these small little workshops. And that system seems to, at least when it comes to late antiquity, seems to have been too chaotic for the Roman government. They didn't like that, right, to basically procure their stuff from a whole variety of little shops, which is why they set up large factories for the army equipment. When it comes to mass-produced goods, such as ceramics, for instance, we do have remarkable areas where several potters gang up to build gigantic pottery kilns, like in La Grosnesque in France, where we have tens of thousands of just discarded vessels, right, that never went anywhere. And of course, but there is a level of industrial production areas that require a lot of capital investment, mostly mining. So basically, Roman mining really takes off in the late 1st century BCE. And you can see that on the basis of pollution levels in Greaseland ice drilling cores, right? So you basically drill one of these drilling cores, and you see how much CO2 is in the atmosphere and how much metal is in the atmosphere, and what's basically happening in the period that I was just talking about, where the level is about almost as high as about 1800, right? So we have a lot of industrial activity going on in the Roman period, and interestingly, not necessarily in large factories, but actually in these hundreds and hundreds of shops that seem to dominate the urban landscape everywhere. So whether we go to Britain, whether we go to Apamea, whether we go to the Magdalensberg, whether we go to Italy, Roman streets are lined by shops and workshops. Yes?
Who would do something like build a boat, for instance?
Well, these, for instance, these people whom I showed to you, these were the Navicularii, and they also had a guild of shipbuilders, right? So you have a particular type of boat builders who are also organized in a voluntary organization. So you probably would have had an owner of a business, right, whom you go to, and who then hires people and craftsmen to work for him. So when it comes to these craftsmen and artisans who are successful, there's a large bandwidth in between them. So there are people who basically are not very successful and have to work for someone else, and people who manage to rise through the ranks through clever business decisions. So for instance, a shoemaker in the town of Beneventum becomes one of the most trusted courtiers of Nero. And he doesn't become that because he makes nice shoes for Nero, but because he becomes so rich that he can throw lavish gladiatorial games when Nero passes through town, and then he notices the guy, right? But his profession is that of a shoemaker, and then there are, of course, poor people who never make it, right? So it's basically not just one particular class of people, there's a lot of difference in between them. But we actually know from Ostia that we have a professional association of shipbuilders, but these shipbuilders are not the guys probably actually building the ship. These are probably the entrepreneurs, the contractors, whom ship captains then go to and commission a ship. Yes?
Would the clubhouses be like the guild system in religious?
No, there is a very important difference between these collegia, which is a term that archaeologists like to use, and guilds. In the medieval system, you have to be a member of the guild in order to practice your craft. In antiquity, that's not the case. In antiquity, this is a voluntary association, or let's put it that way. It's an association where membership cannot be enforced by law. We know from papyri from Egypt what happens to people who are not joining a voluntary association. They usually get beaten up by the people who are in it, right? And there can be a lot of peer pressure and there can be a lot of social engineering, but it's not like a guild where you have to formally belong. So that is an important difference. But there are some really uncanny resemblances between the later medieval guild system and these systems of voluntary associations, because they are organized around a cult. You know, in European Middle Ages, you would have the cult of the Virgin Mary. You know, that would be an important thing. They are also important in terms of social organization. So you meet for regular meals. You have to throw parties when there are certain events in your life. So, for instance, the birth of a child, a marriage. Then you basically have to spend money on that. Also, when it comes to funerary issues, you basically have to help members get a proper burial. So in all these aspects, right, collegia resemble later medieval guilds, but they are different in other respects too, and most crucially, that membership is not compulsory. Yeah?
Was there anything like joint ownership?
Yeah. So there is joint ownership when it comes to, for instance, constructing these large rental apartments. So what I showed you is a small town like Pompeii, where you have individual landlords walling off rooms that they can then let as tabernae. But in a city like Rome, where you have multi-storied apartment buildings, you have joint ownership of these buildings. So you basically have people investing into constructing such an apartment block and then basically reaping the rent, right? So that and distributing it. That is something that existed. And unfortunately, we don't know much about it because Roman aristocrats don't like to write about these things. But there also seem to have been paper bookings and stuff like that. So very sophisticated monetary system that allowed for organizing long-distance trade and long-distance shipping. Yes, Terry?
Question. When you talked about, well, they're renting the shops and they're renting where they live, so are these properties passed from generation to generation, or they bought them out?
Well, interestingly, there seems to be a lot of fluctuation with these shops. There is a very spicy epigram from Pompeii that I didn't show up because it ends in a sexual insult and I was not quite sure whether that's appropriate. But it's basically scratched in front of a rental, right? And the guy who's living in there is assaulted for having had 18 different jobs, right, and have failed in all of them. And then he has only to do sexual insult, and then he'll have done everything, right? So we know that there was an enormous turnover in these shops, right? Which is why it's a place of pride for someone like this Corinthiarius that I showed from Rome, right? To basically say, and my shop is there, right? It basically stayed there for a long time. Usually, property in the Roman world does not stay in one hand for long. So, for instance, Cicero is even very concerned about his villa changing hands shortly after his lifetime because he wants his daughter's tomb to be there, and says, but if it gets sold. And as a matter of fact, houses and with the houses, also the ownership of the shops changes constantly. And because it changes constantly, people have to move constantly. So Martial, Roman poet of the late 1st century CE, writes about people being constantly on the move. So we are basically dealing with a very transient cityscape. On the other hand, we have successful businessmen in Aquileia and other places in the east in these colonnaded streets who basically have the name and the profession laid out in mosaic in front of their shop, which obviously means that they expect to stay there for some time. But again, you probably can't generalize, right? There are very successful people who stay in one place for a long time, and then there are people like this insulted guy that I mentioned who changes jobs every other month.
To what degree was there government control of this industry?
Well, I mean, interestingly, Roman government, the Republicans would love that, it's very small, right? So what Romans usually like to do is to co-opt people to do government business. And what is interesting is that that in the 2nd century CE, when these voluntary associations, these collegia really start taking off, the Roman state co-opts them, right? The Roman state tries to make them agents of the government. So for instance, when certain taxes are levied on water, for instance, for fullers, right? The Roman state says, oh my God, collecting water from every single fuller in town, that's a drag. Let's go to the collegium and let them collect the taxes for us, which is a good deal for the fullers collegium because that gives them bargaining power, right, over how much the government can charge. And there's, for instance, a famous inscription that records a lawsuit between the prefect of the city of Rome and the Fullers Voluntary Association to say, we are not paying these taxes. And actually the Fullers Association wins, which is quite remarkable. So no regulation like today, but some interaction. Yes?
Could you say a few words about the monetary system and how it affected this whole system that you've talked about?
Yeah.
The fact that there was coinage, whereas we're used to the ancient Near East, wasn't any coinage to
Yeah. So what is really remarkable about ancient coinage, Greek and Roman coinage, but in particular Roman coinage, is that it's about small change, right? So if you're basically reading the Karum Karnish texts from the ancient Near East, silver, figures quite prominently, right? But that's, of course, a large denomination. What's really interesting when it comes to monetization in the Roman world is that you find small change wherever you go, right? Go into a theater in Asia Minor that's not excavated and bow down, and you're going to pick up coins that people didn't bother picking up because they were pennies, right? If you basically excavate a shack in the countryside, you always find small change, which means that people also for mini transactions, right, used coinage, right? So when they were buying an onion or what have you not, they were paying for that. They were not bartering with that, which shows you, from an archaeological perspective, first of all, how widespread coinage was, right? So, and of course the denominations change over time, but you have a lot of bronze coinage and you've got a lot of silver coinage. But interestingly, the large transactions that basically deal with inter-regional trade, that seems to have been mostly done in gold. So in very large coins. So for instance, when it comes to these shops in Austria that I've shown to you on the Magdalensberg, all transactions are marked in gold, right? Not in silver. And the reason probably for that is Rome's taxation system, right? So many people have argued that this system of rising commercial cities is actually caused by Roman taxation, right? or taxation of large states. Because coinage in the Roman world, at least when it comes to silver and gold coinage, the large denominations is only minted in one place, in Rome, right? So it flows out from Rome, right? But it also has to flow back in terms of taxes, right? So a British ancient historian called Keith Hopkins, who's now dead, unfortunately, he basically argued that the system of Rome's monetization forced people to produce marketable goods that they could sell to the city of Rome to recoup the money taxes, right? Because they couldn't mint coinage locally. That system is a little bit too simple, but that gives you an idea about what's going on, right? The problem is that in the Roman Empire, for many people, you have to pay taxes in coin. You're not paying in grain usually. You're not paying in vegetables, right? The Roman government wants cash from you. Also, your landlords, who basically, if you're a tenant, either in a city or on the countryside, wants cash from you. You can't pay them in produce, right? Which means that you constantly have to sell things. And the reason that these people want cash is that they have to pay taxes to the Roman government in coin too. So that is part of the answer, I think. But yes, the system itself is a little bit complicated.
Is there much activity in terms of loans or mortgages?
Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, not mortgages as far as I'm aware of, but there are a lot of loans. And you can basically, and you can mortgage your property also in a way, which is one of the reasons, coming back to Terry's question, why property can change hands so easily and so fast, right? So if you basically take up a loan on your property and then your business venture doesn't work, you lose everything, which is why in the Roman world you don't have the type of feudal aristocracy that you have in the Middle Ages in Europe, right? If you're a baron, you have a fief from your king and you can do whatever you want, you can't lose it. If you are a Roman aristocrat and you are in money troubles and you have to sell or mortgage your property and take up loans and debt, you can lose everything. And as a matter of fact, in the Roman Republic, there are some crises that are caused by speculation, for instance, which then lead to a complete collapse of the banking system. There are actually bankers, and these people are called argentarii, or money men, and they wield considerable influence. So, for instance, Vespasian, the Roman emperor, is the son and grandson of bankers, right, of argentarii. He doesn't rise, from a landed aristocracy. These are centurions, so military men turned bankers. No, and there are banking institutions, and there is speculation going on. But as I said, it's mostly done in coin, right? We know from Cicero's letter that there also must have been some kind of written titles when it came to debt. But unfortunately, nothing of that really survives, and it is all very misty and shadowy. Yes?
Your portrayal seems to be indicating a fairly mobile, entrepreneurial society where there would be a fair degree of mobility between the classes and change in families quite much more rapid than I would have thought.
Yeah, exactly. So the Roman imperial period is actually characterized by a lot of social mobility, both upward and downward, right? Which basically arises for something that one can call, in purely economic terms, the middle class. So people in a tripartite society standing between the destitute, standing between the rich, and having the potential for upward and downward social mobility. And you have a large mobility of people also, right? So for instance, when you're dealing with a city like Rome, right, which has 1 million inhabitants in antiquity, it's like New York City, right? The city cannot procreate enough people to basically fill up the losses. So you have constant immigration into the city of Rome, and you have immigration into many other places too. And just to give you examples of social mobility, I talked about the shoemaker. His name is Vatinius. There are other even more extreme cases of social mobility. So for instance, Pertinax, Roman emperor, short-lived at the end of the 2nd century. He's the son of a freedman, right? So his dad was a slave, son's emperor, right? Already at the beginning of the 1st century CE, Tiberius, the 2nd emperor, right, has to indulge conservative elements in the senatorial aristocracy by throwing out all senators who are the descendants of freedmen, right? So you have people who, through their skill and through their entrepreneurial talent, manage to rise to the highest ranks of society. So for instance, one of the contractors from Austria's Contractors Club, right? He becomes stinking rich. He becomes so stinking rich that he can buy off the whole town. His sons become knights, and his grandsons are senators in the Roman state. So yes, social mobility works very well, but it also works down the other way. So for instance, the son of Hortensius, the great rival of Cicero, right, who is also a very rich man, he loses everything he has. And he doesn't even meet the minimum requirement for senatorial property, which is 1 million sesterces, anymore. So he goes to the emperor and says, please, 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 Tiberius, give me a little bit more money so that I can stay a senator, so that my sons, the grandchildren of Hortensius, have the chance of a political career. And interestingly, Tiberius says, I'm doing this for your children. I'm not doing this for you, you loser, right? And if your sons don't succeed either, well, then it's their bad luck, right? Interestingly, for instance, in the city of Rome, no senatorial family in the imperial period can be traced back for more than 3 generations, right? After 3 generations, the name usually goes to another family, and the particular family dies out. So a very, vibrant society in that respect. Yes?
Would you say it's the origin of the distinction between old money and new money?
Yeah, that exists too, actually. So there is a famous novel written probably by Petronius, Nero's Arbiter Elegantiarum, so basically his judge of elegance, right? And Petronius is very old money. And in this book, the Satirica, there is a famous episode called Trimalchio's dinner party. And Trimalchio is a freedman who's become very rich. And he is ridiculed as a guy who has no class, who doesn't understand what he's talking about, who aspires to the elegant lifestyle of the aristocracy, but doesn't get it at all. So this type of distinction does exist, and that's interesting because if you are interested in ancient literature, that's a kind of social satire you don't find before the system that I've just outlined. You don't find that before the 1st century CE, right? Where you have people being ridiculed for being classless but very rich. And that is also a perpetual concern of Roman poets in the city of Rome, so Martial and Juvenal, right? That they are well-bred intellectuals, right? And you've got all these rich people who have it so much better than they do. And of course they are then ridiculed for not having class, for being uncultured, for being nouveau riche, effectively. So that does exist, actually, in literature in particular. And that is, of course, from a perspective of social history, also very interesting. Yes? Sorry.
Is there any evidence that this relative social and entrepreneurial energy and mobility led, particularly in the history of the it led to technological advances and
Yeah, so I mean, so what happened in the Roman imperial period in terms of growth, if you want to conceptualize in economic terms, is mostly extensive growth, right? But you also have intensive growth through technological innovation. And that is something that has only been has recently come to the forefront of scholarly attention. But there are some really remarkable engineering breakthroughs. So for instance, the guys who make this settlement in Austria, they make a particular type of steel. It's called ferrum noricum, right? Which by modern standards qualifies as steel, right? So they basically come up with a new type of metal, right? That then becomes marketable. We also see an increased use of machinery, right? So water mills, complicated sawing mechanisms, and so forth. And there's actually a nice episode to back that up. So there is an architect who invents a new crane, right? So in Rome, if you want to build big buildings, you need cranes, and these cranes are operated by large tread wheels. And he goes to Vespasian and says, I've made this great invention, we can make do with half the people, right? And expects that the emperor then, pays him off. And the emperor says, I give you a lot of money not to put this invention to use, because then we will basically have too much unemployment in the city of Rome, right? Whether that story is true or not, right, is an entirely different matter. And of course, it's written from a particular perspective, and it's very unlikely that an emperor would have said that. However, it shows you that there is, of course, innovation, and that people basically try to save labor, right, by through technological innovation. So that does happen. And indeed, many technological advances of the Roman imperial period then only, were taken up in the 18th century, 17th, 18th century again. So for instance, stocked anchors, right? That's something that the Romans did. It took until the 16th century in Europe until you had stocked anchors again. Same thing applies to bilge pumps, right? Most Roman ships actually had an elaborate pumping system to get the water out, right? Also that was forgotten until later again. So if you read in older handbooks, that the Romans didn't really do technology, that's not true. They did that, right? And that it were the Middle Ages that effectively started using the water wheel for the first time. Also, that's not true, right? That's what the Romans also did. So yes, so we do see technological innovation. Yeah? Yes, please?
I'm interested in how they try to regulate the economy. So, for example, if there was an overabundance of, say, wine or oil or whatever commodity, that would create prices to come down. So the sellers would make little or nothing. Some of them might even lose money. On the other hand, if there was scarcity, the prices would go up, and only the wealthy would be able to afford those economies. So you would have widespread deprivation. So what did they do to try to keep these wild price swings from happening in economic chaos?
Well, there is very little evidence for regulation. And if regulation happens, it doesn't happen along the lines of modern economic thought. So to give you an example of regulation in the Roman Empire, at the time, according to the logic that you just outlined, you can make a lot of money with wine, right? Because Romans drink a lot of wine. Augustus was considered to be a light drinker because he only had about a bottle of wine each day, right? And because he could make so much money with wine, in Italy, which is a country where you can grow wine very nicely, people were abandoning all other agricultural pursuits and only setting up vineyards. That led to a crisis in the grain supply, right? And in other places, which is why Emperor Domitian then ordered that half of all vineyards in Italy were to be destroyed, right? And no other vineyards were to be planted. But that is one of the very rare instances where I can think about it, but that is exactly what you're talking about. So there are entrepreneurially minded people who try to make a lot of money, which changes, of course, price dynamics, and sometimes even leads to supply crises, right? As in the case of grain, for instance. And emperors, in particular, don't like it if bread prices go up, right? Because if bread prices go up, people get really angry, and that creates political unrest. You don't want that. But the rationale for the Roman government to interfere is, at least as far as I can see it, always a political decision. It's never an economic decision. So another famous example would be in the 4th century CE, Julian the Apostate is in Antioch. There is a grain crisis. So what does he do? He buys up a lot of grain from Antioch, from Egypt, and distributes it and sells it. What happens? Speculators buy up the grain at the cheap price that the emperor guarantees, and then try to resell it at higher prices, right? Which basically leads to a lot of political turmoil, right? So you have an emperor like Julian who doesn't think about these things, right? Because he doesn't think in these categories. But obviously, you have a stratum of people who think that way, right? And as you have seen in the case of Dio Chrysostom, you've got these, at least the people who are writing literature, right? They are not very smart when it comes to economic matters, quite frequently. So it's a complicated issue, and the issue is primarily complicated because of our dearth of evidence, right? We don't have much on that. Yes? No, there are variety, no, not income tax, but there are a variety of other taxes. So, for instance, I mentioned the tax raised by the Fullers, then there is an inheritance tax, then there are, various taxes. But these taxes change over the course of time. Taxes on land, for instance. So taxes do exist, but not an income tax. That's a modern invention.
The volume of the sales demand.
Pardon me?
The volume merchants sold didn't affect what they paid in tax.
That depended on whether they, for instance, like the Fullers of Rome, used a lot of water in their production. So basically, if they use items that are highly taxed or raw materials that are highly taxed, then of course their tax volume goes up, right? But they are not taxed, they don't have a value-added tax on their products, right? Mm-hmm.
You had mentioned that there were approximately 200 food bars in Pompeii, and that there were many, many apartments and around 600 shops. Is there an estimate as to how many apartments, a rough number, that there would have been in the town, so we can get an idea of how many may have rented, contrasted to the number of houses?
Yeah, so there is, taken into consideration that a quarter of Pompeii remains unexcavated, I think the rough number, there is an exact number, the rough number is also about 400, right? So actually, as I said, about half and half. You have half of Pompeians living in houses, which of course large households. This is not a core family, right? This includes slaves and other dependents. And then you have about the other half of households living in tabernae or living in rented apartments. These households are probably smaller than, in terms of the people living in these households, than the households living in these larger houses, but it still makes for a remarkable number of people, which forces us, at least in terms of Pompeian population estimates, to correct our numbers a little upwards, ever since that has been studied. So yes, so there are actually quite a few people living in apartments in Pompeii and Herculaneum, and in a place like Rome where estimates have been made, in Ostia where estimates have been made, you're probably dealing with about 90% of all households living in apartments. So a very large number of people, yeah.
I know it's very popular to make trade analogies between Rome and the modern world, but would you describe the Romans, at least within the Mediterranean world, to be early globalists and early free traders and setting up a globalist within the Mediterranean global world?
The difficulty when talking about the Roman Empire is that so much seems to be so familiar to us, right, that we overlook the obvious differences that exist. I think the best answer that I could give to that is that the Romans wouldn't have thought of themselves that way, right? We can basically talk about the Romans in these terms if we like to, right? But the Romans wouldn't have had an argument on this. Actually, people like Pliny the Elder would have been protectionists, right? Because there is a intensive trade between the Roman Empire and India. And that trade goes via the Red Sea, right? So you have the Egyptian port of Elephantine on the Red Sea, and then you have got ships with the monsoon going to India and back to buy spices, which is really fascinating because one survey of Roman shipwrecks on the western coast of India has turned up hundreds of Roman shipwrecks. And if you excavate Roman period sites in India at the coast, you have tons of Roman ceramics there. Why on earth would they bring Roman ceramics to India? Anyway, Pliny is getting very upset that this causes a trade deficit between the Roman Empire and India because people are buying so much spices and can't, of course, sell enough stuff in return. He also gets very upset about the silk trade with China and various other kinds of trades. So at least one Roman I can present to you who was very concerned about trade deficits and wanted to curb this kind of trade because he felt that too much valuable currency was being wasted, which is also part of another debate on luxury, but yeah.
Well, I want to thank you for this outstanding lecture and the discussion that really brought to speak of an ancient economy. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your attention.